Hello, A-level psychology, and welcome to your second to last issue or debate you're going to look at. So with me, that's the second to last new thing you'll ever learn, and I think you might finish learning all of your new content with Andy, so it's possibly the second to last new thing you will ever learn on A-level psychology. Which I'm sure you're extremely devastated about, although that does then mean revision starts and you realise quite how much content you have to go over. There we go, we have the specifications, as you can see, idiographic and nomothetic approach at the bottom, to approaches to psychological investigation, so these to link directly to how we investigate psychology and psychological concepts. And then the one underneath, ethical implications as well, which would be a nice easy one, fingers crossed. And then the types of questions you get, so of course you get your AO2, so the minute you see application and the minute that you sort of see a stimulus, you know you must include, refer back to that stimulus by quoting it and linking it directly to key terms, so that's something you consider. And then a nice little multiple choice, because we do occasionally get multiple choice as well. So the idiographic approach, so idio or idios means own, so it's all about, and I always remember it that way because it's all about individual cases and not developing universal laws. So the way that they approach conducting research is they look at individual cases and of course, as that sounds, individual case studies, and have a look at their behaviour and explore them in lots and lots of detail. So of course, that relies a lot on qualitative methods. Such as case studies, and then the way that you collect those, so unstructured interviews, thematic analysis, all of that qualitative kind of in-depth descriptive detail. So really simple tip just to remind you of, because I've mentioned it a few times, is quantitative and qualitative. If you were asked about qualitative data, which potentially you could be, that is not, you would never ever describe qualitative data as written, because of course numbers can be written as well. So quantitative, quantity is numerical, and then qualitative is descriptive, in-depth, detailed data that is, well, it is written, but so is numerical, so there'd be no benefit to writing written, so do not say that. Okay. And then you've got some nice examples here. So you've got Freud, who looked at little hands, and you've got Allport, who looked at somebody called Jenny Masterton, and also Jeannie as well. So Allport, I don't think Allport looked at Jeannie, it's just that there's Jeannie, who was looked at by, considered by several psychologists, and we have briefly considered her. All three of those are really fascinating case studies that I'd encourage you to do some additional reading around, but what you must be really careful of is not to get lost in describing those. So of course you had Freud with little hands, which was linked to the Oedipus complex, so the idea that he developed a fear of horses, which was linked to his father because the horse had a similar spot on his nose, which linked, Freud claimed, to his father's moustache. So there's that. And then Allport, Jenny Masterton, he looked at letters that had been sent over a decade to kind of explore how people's personalities changed and expanded. And these are all individual cases, so looking individually at people, not about creating universal laws. Although, of course, some case studies can be used in two ways. They can be used to then support universal laws, but more importantly, they can be used to break down, if you think about falsifiability, break down theories. So you've also got the ones you looked at with memory. So I think it was HM that you would have looked at, which of course supported a certain type of memory that you want to have a think about. You could talk about the memory that he supported. Did you have a look at any other? Did you look at Clive Waring? Whatever it might be, have a think of that. And then of course we briefly looked at Jeannie, and we talked about brain plasticity, and also kind of neurons and how they are destroyed if they're not used. And she's another really interesting one to look at, but you must look from a psychological point of view, not just from a sense of all the quite upsetting but fascinating experiences that she had. And then, of course, there's the nomothetic approach, which is formulating general rules of behaviours, as exactly as it's said. So they conduct huge studies, as big as possible, to collect as much data from as many people as possible, and then, of course, they can generalise. Ideally, they have a huge sample with high population validity, but of course, that's not very rarely the case. But potentially, that's what we consider, and that's quantitative research. They look at measures of central tendency and how so kind of the average. And then if you think about intelligence, that's a perfect example. So you've got the mean, and then you've got measures of central tendency, how far people deviate from that mean, dispersion, all of those things. So of course, measures of central tendency, mode, median, median and mean, and measures of dispersion, range and standard deviation. So don't confuse those two. And then so examples of this would be the biological approach, fight or flight. They looked at a huge sample of animals. Behaviourist approach, classical and operant conditioning, they conducted, although they did use examples such as little Albert, they also conducted huge ranges of research and developed generalized laws, which is really, really important as well. Cognitive approach, models of memory, think of all the different pieces of research you've done. And Eysenck's personality inventory used huge samples to gather averages. Now I'm sure you can do the same thing. Think back to a lot of your topic 1 stuff you did with Andy, and possibly year 2 stuff as well. So I think you did you do something on stress where you looked at naval officers, anything like that, any study that has a huge sample and then they generalize that and kind of make certain rules about it, certain laws. Okay, so it's just 2 different ways they conduct research. There's some example of Gordon Allport looking at Jenny Marston and some questions you could answer, which I'd encourage you to do, and I can have a look at those as well. And then evaluation, so we've got 2 for the nomothetic and 2 for the ideographic. So and they can be used exactly as the same way as other ones. So even if you were asked to just evaluate the nomothetic approach, you've only got 2 strengths for the nomothetic approach, but you could then use a weakness of the ideographic as a strength of the nomothetic as a comparison. And of course you could use the interactionist approach in 3 ways: as a strength, a weakness, or a conclusion. So a strength of the debate is that from it became the combined approach or the interactionist approach. A weakness is that the nomothetic approach doesn't consider working in a interactionist way, that's the best way to work. So you could use it either of those ways, or you could say in conclusion, the most effective kind of method or explanation because of the weaknesses of both sides of the debate is, and you can talk about it like that. Okay, so the nomothetic approach, highly scientific, and I'm not going to talk to you too much about that because that would be your strength. And then of course experimental methods, quantitative data, you can talk all about the different things, you can analyze and develop trends, it's highly replicable. Scientific methods, high in validity, what can you talk about there? So you can break it all down, so it's really, really reliable. And of course, if we have large samples, population validity, all those different things you can talk about. It's also excellent because we can develop general laws about it in the way that an idiographic approach can't. So again, a weakness of the idiographic approach, if you were asked to do that, would be that it can predict and therefore allow us to control or support behaviour. So not necessarily control is possibly the wrong word. So for example, you've got OCD and you've got drug therapies. So by looking at a huge sample of people, we were able to gather lots of information and identify that OCD was caused due to these different levels of dopamine and serotonin, and therefore drug therapy could be developed, which allowed us to kind of predicted people's behaviour. So these levels of hormones suggest this person will display this kind of OCD behaviour, and then drug therapy. So this is the drug that would work the most effective to reduce symptoms. Of course, there's always a danger with that, is that we're ignoring the fact that CBT is an incredibly effective method. CBT is much more individualised than drug therapy because it works within an individual person. So you could talk about the danger of the nomothetic approach, then kind of applying inappropriate treatments to some people, because as we all know, not all OCD, not all depression is completely cured from somebody by drug therapy. Other support needs to be in place, and as I've spoken about before, there was a piece of research that found it was a combination of CBT and drugs that was the most effective in reducing OCD behaviours, which of course if it was purely nomothetic would not be the case. It would only be drug therapy that worked. We wouldn't need to worry about the CBT. So that would be a however sentence you could talk about. The idiographic approach then lacks scientific research because it's too reliant on case studies. So your strength would be lack scientific research, and then the bullet point below the example would be too reliant on case studies. Talk about a couple of case studies, tell me what's the problem with the case studies. However, why are case studies good? Why do we use them? We use them because they allow us to kind of consider people's lives in depth and sort of gather a huge wealth of information, which is really, really helpful. And then, of course, at the beginning for the example, you talk about the strengths of case studies. So go back in your book, have a look at the strengths of the case studies, the weaknesses of case studies first of all, and then you say, however, and consider the strengths. The weaknesses of case studies is one person. What's the impact on population validity? Is there some potential for investigative bias? The investigators become too involved. Look at all those different things. Genie is a perfect example of that. Little Hans, Freud, that different psychologists would have explained that same behaviour in hundreds of different ways, and because Freud was so keen to explain it through the Oedipus complex that way, that he would he would develop that as the findings. So use it as a twofold thing. Don't forget, not long now to your paper 2, which has lots of research methods on, so go back and read about case studies, and then you can use the strengths and the weaknesses for that, and then you've saved yourself some time. You don't need to learn anything new. And then the interactionist approach. So either a strength of the debate is that it's finally kind of landed on this combined approach, a weakness, or you could use it as a weakness. So either end of the debate doesn't consider the interactionist approach, which is the most high in validity, or in conclusion, the most appropriate kind of approach. So you could use it in any of those 3 ways. And the idea would just be to start off as nomothetic, so you would want these generalized rules, and then it would be refined down to an idiographic approach, so individualized drug therapy. So we want to know that generally it's dopamine and serotonin levels that impact OCD, but could we look specifically at this one person's level of serotonin and dopamine and therefore apply drug therapy? It's a really, really interesting piece of research by Carlson about schizophrenia, and now that is on the Edexcel spec, but it is one that you could use. And Carlson found that traditionally the view is that it's all about the dopamine hypothesis, and actually he found that glutamate also interacted with dopamine to cause those levels. So previously we'd focused on giving schizophrenics drugs that focused on their dopamine, but actually we found that, and then when Carson did some more research, he also found that potentially it was the levels of glutamate which impacted the levels of dopamine. So instead of going for the dopamine, we could go straight for the glutamate, and that worked for some people and it didn't work for others. So the belief is that eventually there'll be this really individualized kind of approach of general rules. You need to look at serotonin for depression, say, and then we would consider what levels of serotonin, are there any other kind of knock-on effects for this individual person, what would be the best drug. And then of course we've got the idea of Freud. So unfortunately for once, he's potentially you could use him as a strength, so hold him up as a good example, which is interesting. So Freud, case studies, Little Hans and so on, which were then developed into general laws. So Little Hans and other case studies that he looked at, eventually he developed these general laws such as the Oedipus complex. So it can be we can use a mixture of the two, so going from idiographic to nomothetic. So the first one is nomothetic to idiographic, where we go from big rules about drugs and biological stuff and generalize that down to make it more individualized. The other way you could approach it is that you start off a theory by collecting some case studies and then using them to develop general laws as well. Either way, as always, the interactionist approach is the best way to do that because it considers both quantitative and qualitative data, which is positive, and as always, links to validity as well. And it'd be difficult to think of, however, apart from the fact that it's very complex and difficult, whereas a nomothetic or idiographic allows you to kind of conduct one type of research and use that. I suppose the interactionist approach is very time consuming and challenging to ensure that both your nomothetic and your idiographic research is well conducted to ensure validity, but you could talk about that as well. And that is it. So that is the end of your second to last ever piece of research that you need to look at with me, or issue a debate. This is the example that I took from the Green Haired Girl. So you've got a scan of this as well, but there's also a picture here, and this talks about the idiographic approach, realising that it's narrow and restricted nature of its work, so focusing on the idea of case studies being quite specific and how they can't really be generalised effectively and appropriately. And then this is about the kind of sitting them together, so the kind of the combined approach. And there's loads of information everywhere, and there's some additional reading, and I personally cannot recommend Tutor to you highly enough. They are excellent if you're really, really struggling with any of the stuff I've said today, please go look to the Tutor to You webinar, also read some of that information. There's the Simply Psychology as well, which is good. Please do that additional round subject reading. The best way to learn is for you to search out and answer the questions yourself, because you'll remember that information much, much better than if you say, ask me in class, Harry, I don't understand, and I explain, you think, oh yeah, I get it, and then a week later you think, no, I can't remember what that was. By searching it out yourself, you remember much, much more. So please take the resources from loads of different places. Use this as a starting point, or the other way around. You could have done all your notes in your books and then referred to this one to kind of just check them. And it says, and then right at the bottom, an article on the greatest case studies in psychology. Indicating case studies can be very significant in steering psychological knowledge and research. So that's something else that you could consider as well, the idea that actually case studies are extremely significant within psychology. As you know, there are a huge number of very famous ones that you could refer to when you talk about the Idiographic Approach. So that is that. Enjoy the Idiographic and the Nomothetic Approach, and I will talk to you again in Ethical Issues, the final study that we need to look at. Thank you.